October 25th, 1944, 3:52 in the morning. The black waters of Surigao Strait lay motionless under heavy cloud cover. No moonlight, no stars. Darkness absolute. Aboard USS West Virginia, Lieutenant Commander Robert McComb hunched over the pale green glow of his Mark 8 fire control radar, watching a single bright pip crawl northward at 42,000 yards. Behind that radar return, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura steered his flagship Yamashiro directly into what naval commanders had dreamed of for centuries but rarely achieved: a perfect textbook ambush. Within minutes, 6 American battleships would unleash a storm of armor-piercing shells, and the oldest tactical doctrine in naval warfare would prove one final time that sometimes the ancient rules still applied. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why this night mattered, one must grasp what had vanished from the Pacific by October 1944. Japan's fleet carriers lay scattered across the ocean floor. Midway, the Philippine Sea, the Solomons. Each battle stripped away naval aviation and trained pilots who could never be replaced. The Great Marianas Turkey shoot in June had massacred over 600 aircraft in 2 days. By autumn, Japan's carrier decks stood empty. But Japan still possessed battleships, massive steel fortresses whose guns could obliterate destroyers and whose armor could absorb devastating punishment. Yamato and Musashi mounted 18-inch guns. Older battleships like Fusō and Yamashiro carried 12 14-inch guns apiece. These were functional weapons capable of devastating firepower under the right circumstances. Strategists in Tokyo understood the mathematics of desperation. MacArthur had returned to the Philippines on October 20th with overwhelming force. If the beachhead solidified, Japan's oil supply lines from the Dutch East Indies would be severed. Without fuel, the fleet would rust. The factories would fall silent. Tokyo issued Shogo, victory operation. It was not optimistic. It was final. The plan divided Japan's remaining fleet into multiple prongs converging on Leyte Gulf. Admiral Kurita would bring the most powerful force, including super battleships Yamato and Musashi, through San Bernardino Strait to the north. Carrier decoys under Admiral Ozawa would lure away Halsey's fast carriers, leaving the invasion fleet vulnerable. Vice Admiral Nishimura would steam through Surigao Strait from the south, arriving at dawn to catch the invasion fleet between converging attacks. The timing had to be perfect. All forces synchronized. No second chances. Nishimura commanded the southern force. 2 battleships, Fusō and Yamashiro, launched in the 1910s, carried 12 14-inch guns apiece. Neither had seen serious action. Both had spent the war conducting, training in Japan's inland sea, their experienced crews transferred elsewhere. But their guns still worked. Nishimura was 54, a Naval War College graduate. His son had been killed in combat in 1941. Those who served under him described a man transformed by grief, willing to accept risk, even to court death. In 1942 at Guadalcanal, reports called his fighting lion-like fury. Some said reckless, others said brave. Alongside the battleships steamed the heavy cruiser Mogami, a veteran of Midway, and 4 destroyers: Michishio, Asagumo, Yamagumo, Shigure, 7 warships total. Behind Nishimura, separated by 25 miles and poor radio coordination, Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima followed with another force. 3 cruisers, 4 more destroyers. Theoretically, they would merge into a combined assault. Realistically, they barely communicated. Nishimura knew the odds. Reconnaissance aircraft had spotted massive American formations near Leyte. Reports counted battleships, cruisers, dozens of destroyers. The numbers painted a grim picture. But Shogo demanded sacrifice. Someone had to tie down the American southern defenses so Kurita's central force could break through. Nishimura accepted the role with what his officers later described as lion-like fury tempered by fatalistic calm. Meanwhile, American commanders watched the approaching threat with cold calculation. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded the 7th Fleet, responsible for protecting MacArthur's invasion. When intelligence confirmed Japanese forces steaming toward Surigao Strait, Kinkaid delegated the problem to Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, a burly Californian who commanded the fire support battleships. Oldendorf's task was straightforward: stop anything that came through the strait. The force at Oldendorf's disposal represented poetic reversal. 6 battleships formed his battle line: West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Mississippi. 5 had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. 3 had sunk into Battleship Rose mud. West Virginia had been moored outboard of Tennessee that Sunday morning. When Japanese aircraft struck at 8:05, she lay exposed. 7 Type 91 torpedoes slammed her port side. 2 armor-piercing bombs hit. Lieutenant Claude Ricketts made the decision that saved her, ordering counter-flooding of starboard compartments to prevent capsizing. The gamble worked. West Virginia settled evenly to the harbor bottom in 40 feet of water rather than rolling over. 106 men died. And when salvage crews raised her on May 17, 1942, they found 70 bodies in flooded compartments. In one space, a calendar showed the last date scratched off was December 23rd. Men had survived 16 days in darkness, slowly suffocating while rescue efforts continued overhead, separated from salvation only by twisted steel. Pearl Harbor's shallow water allowed salvage. The sunken battleships were raised and sent to West Coast shipyards. West Virginia spent over 2 years at Puget Sound Navy Yard. The reconstruction was transformative. Engineers stripped the old superstructure completely. Cage masts came down. Modern tower structures rose to carry heavy radar. The hull was widened with anti-torpedo bulges. Additional armor went on. Old guns were replaced with modern dual-purpose mounts. Most critically, West Virginia received Mark 8 fire control radar, revolutionary technology that could track ships at 25,000 yards, pierce darkness, and feed firing solutions automatically. Where human eyes saw nothing, Mark 8 painted precise pictures. Tennessee and California got similar upgrades. Maryland and Pennsylvania received lesser modifications. Mississippi carried older equipment but remained capable. But technology alone would not win the battle. Tactics mattered, and Oldendorf possessed the geographical gift every naval commander craved. Surigao Strait was a narrow passage of water between the islands of Leyte and Mindanao. It stretched roughly 40 miles north to south, hemmed by land on both sides. Currents ran swift. Navigation required careful piloting. Most critically, any force approaching from the south would be compressed into a single column, unable to maneuver freely, forced to steam directly toward whoever waited at the northern exit. Oldendorf intended to wait there. He would position his battleships in an east-west line across the strait's mouth, his cruisers flanking both sides, his destroyers forward and ready to launch torpedo attacks. When Nishimura emerged from the southern narrows, he would find himself approaching perpendicular to the American battle line. Every American gun could fire broadsides. Nishimura's ships could only reply with forward turrets. Naval tacticians called this crossing the T. The enemy approaches in line, forming the vertical stroke. The waiting force positions perpendicular, forming the horizontal stroke. Every gun in the horizontal line fires broadsides. The vertical line replies only with forward turrets. The tactical advantage is overwhelming. Admiral Togo crossed the Russian T at Tsushima in 1905, annihilating the Baltic Fleet. Jellicoe attempted it at Jutland in 1916. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese cruisers repeatedly caught American ships at disadvantageous angles during Solomon's night actions, exploiting superior optics and long-lance torpedoes. But radar changed everything. Mark 8 gave American ships sight in absolute darkness. Technology had shifted the advantage, and Oldendorf possessed both technology and geographical position to exploit it fully. He called a conference aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser Louisville. Rear Admiral George Weyler, commanding the battle line, and Rear Admiral Russell Berkey, commanding the right flank cruisers, gathered to discuss the plan. Oldendorf's orders emphasized simplicity and coordination. The PT boats would scout southward through the strait and into the Mindanao Sea beyond, serving as early warning pickets. 39 small, fast patrol torpedo boats spread across multiple patrol lines. Their mission was to detect, report, and harass. Next would come the destroyers, positioned in 2 flanking groups along the strait's edges. Captain Jesse Coward commanded Destroyer Squadron 54, already on anti-submarine patrol. He would attack from the east. Captain Kenneth McMains led the right flank destroyers. Captain Roland Smoot commanded the left flank. Both groups would launch coordinated torpedo salvos as the Japanese advanced, then withdraw behind smoke screens. Finally, the heavy units. 8 cruisers, split between left and right flanks, would add their fire from the sides. And across the top of the T, steaming slowly back and forth on an east-west axis, the 6 battleships would wait. They would hold fire until the Japanese came within decisive range, then unleash everything. One critical problem gnawed at Oldendorf. His battleships carried the wrong ammunition. For days, they had been conducting shore bombardment, hammering Japanese positions on Leyte with high-explosive shells designed to destroy fortifications and infantry. Those shells were useless against armoured warships. Armour-piercing rounds could penetrate battleship plating and detonate inside, causing catastrophic damage. But the bombardment had depleted stockpiles. West Virginia had fewer than 200 armour-piercing shells remaining. The other battle wagons faced similar shortages. Oldendorf calculated the risk. He could not afford a prolonged slugging match. Every shot had to count. The destroyers would have to cripple the Japanese formation before the big guns even spoke. His cruisers would harass and confuse. The battleships would deliver the killing blow with whatever ammunition remained. It was a gamble born of necessity, concealed behind confident tactical planning. As twilight faded on October 24th, Oldendorf's ships moved into position. The PT boats raced southward, their crews young and inexperienced, many fresh from training schools where torpedo drills consisted of classroom lectures rather than live shots. They carried Mark 13 torpedoes, weapons infamous for running erratically, failing to detonate, or simply sinking after launch. But they had speed, numbers, and the advantage of surprise. Behind them, the destroyers took station along the strait's flanks, their torpedo tubes trained south, their crews at battle stations. The cruisers formed a loose gauntlet, ready to pour fire from both sides. And at the northern end, the battleships assumed their stately patrol, steaming slowly east, then west, waiting for radar contacts that would inevitably appear. Below decks on West Virginia, sailors checked ammunition hoists and gun mechanisms. Turret crews rehearsed loading sequences. Fire, control officers calibrated radar displays. Captain Herbert Wiley, known as a careful, methodical commander, reviewed damage control procedures. His ship had survived Pearl Harbor through skillful counterflooding by Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, who prevented capsizing by deliberately flooding starboard compartments to offset the port torpedo damage. That lesson remained burned into the crew's consciousness. Preparation saved lives. In the Combat Information Center, radar scopes glowed softly. Young enlisted men hunched over the displays, watching the southern approaches. Empty water, dark screens. The minutes stretched. Tension built not from fear but from anticipation. This was what the Navy had trained for. This was what the Pearl Harbor survivors had been rebuilt for. Revenge was too simple a word. This was validation. Proof that the doctrine of the battle line, pronounced obsolete by aviation advocates, still held lethal relevance when circumstances aligned. Shortly after, 2200 hours on October 24th, the PT boats made contact. Lieutenant Commander Robert Leeson, commanding the forward patrol line from PT-134, spotted silhouettes through patchy darkness. Japanese destroyers, steaming in tight formation. Behind them loomed larger shapes, battleship superstructures, unmistakable even in poor visibility. The southern force had arrived right on schedule, exactly where intelligence predicted. PT boats scrambled to attack positions, their engines roaring as they accelerated to intercept. These were small craft, wooden hulls barely 80 feet long, powered by 3 Packard engines that could push them to 40 knots in calm water. They carried 4 Mark 13 torpedoes, the same unreliable weapons that had plagued American forces early in the war. Improvements had been made, reliability had increased, but PT boat crews still approached torpedo attacks with more hope than confidence. The Japanese opened fire immediately. Secondary batteries erupted, 5-inch shells splashing around the nimble patrol boats. Machine guns chattered, tracers drawing orange lines through darkness. Searchlights stabbed outward, seeking targets. Some PT boats found themselves caught in multiple beams simultaneously, illuminated like actors on a stage, shells converging from several ships at once. The noise was overwhelming. The concussions from near misses knocked men off their feet. Spray from shell splashes drenched everyone topside. PT boats launched torpedoes wildly, desperately, their crews inexperienced and rattled by the volume of incoming fire. Lieutenant J.G. Terry Chambers, executive officer of PT-491, described the scene as surreal, darkness punctuated by muzzle flashes, the smell of cordite mixing with salt spray, the shuddering impacts of shells hitting water close enough to lift the boat bodily. Some torpedoes ran true but missed. Others ran deep, passing beneath Japanese hulls without detonating. Few failed to arm properly, their impact exploders never activating even when they struck. PT-490 took hits early, her wooden hull splintering under shell fragments. Men scrambled to plug holes even as the boat maintained speed. PT-493, commanded by Lieutenant J.G. Richard Brown, pressed her attack aggressively, closing to point-blank range before launching. As she turned to escape, 3 shells from what survivors believed was Yamashiro's secondary battery struck in quick succession. One killed the radar operator instantly. Another killed a gunner and wounded several others, including Brown himself. The third punched a hole clean through the hull just above the waterline. Petty Officer Albert Brunel, a slight young man whom his shipmates had quietly doubted would be useful in combat, saw water pouring through the breach. Without hesitation, he tore off his life jacket and stuffed it into the hole, then braced himself against it with his body. The makeshift plug held, barely. PT-493 stayed afloat just long enough for Brown to steer her onto the rocks off Panayon Island's coast. The crew waded ashore in darkness, expecting Japanese troops. Instead, Filipino villagers found them the next morning. PT-491 rescued the crew. The boat itself slipped off the rocks with the tide and sank in deep water. Brunel would receive the Navy Cross for his actions, recognition that courage came in many forms and from unexpected sources. Despite the chaos, despite the incoming fire and the failed torpedoes and the sheer terror of attacking battleships with wooden boats, the PT boats accomplished their primary mission. They reported contact, they transmitted bearings, speed estimates, formation composition. They forced Nishimura to reveal his presence, to commit to his course, to expose himself to the layered defenses waiting ahead. Intelligence flowed back to Louisville, where Oldendorf received updates with grim satisfaction. The trap was sprung. The prey had entered the killing ground. Now came the waiting. Nishimura steamed onward at 20 knots, his formation tight, his resolve unshaken. He had passed the first layer of defense. The real killing had not yet begun. Inside the strait, darkness pressed absolute. No moon illuminated the water. Cloud cover smothered starlight. The islands loomed as black voids against a slightly less black sky. For Japanese lookouts, trained in visual night fighting techniques that had dominated Solomon's battles, the conditions seemed acceptable. They scanned westward, where American forces might approach from open water. They did not expect attack from ahead, where the strait narrowed. They did not anticipate enemies lurking along the flanks, invisible against the island shadows. At 0300 hours, on October 25th, the destroyer attacks began. This was what American destroyer doctrine had been refined toward through 3 years of hard lessons: coordinated attacks, radar-guided approaches, torpedo spreads calculated for maximum probability of hit. Captain Jesse Coward's Squadron 54 struck first from the east, emerging from the darkness like sharks scenting blood. 3 destroyers led the charge: Reme, McGowan, and Melvin. They raced toward the Japanese column at high speed, their bows throwing white spray, their crews at battle stations, torpedomen standing ready at the tubes. Radar operators called continuous bearings and ranges. Fire control officers calculated intercept angles. This was not the wild melee of early war destroyer actions. This was precision violence, choreographed and rehearsed. At optimal range, the destroyers launched their torpedoes in carefully timed spreads. The Mark 15 torpedoes, finally reliable after years of fixing flawed depth mechanisms and faulty exploders, ran straight and true at 46 knots. Each carried over 800 pounds of Torpex explosive, more powerful than TNT, designed specifically to crack battleship hulls. The geometry was merciless. Nishimura's ships presented broadside targets as they steamed north in column formation. The American torpedoes converged from the side, multiple weapons targeting each ship, saturating the defensive space. Fusō, steaming second in line behind a destroyer screen, took at least one massive torpedo hit on her starboard side. The explosion tore a hole 20 feet across, shredding plating, collapsing bulkheads, flooding boiler rooms instantly. A second torpedo may have struck moments later, though chaos made accurate assessment impossible. The impacts were catastrophic. Seawater poured in by thousands of tons. The battleship lurched violently, her bow dipping, her stern rising, smoke billowing from ruptured uptakes. Below decks, engineering crews fought a losing battle against the flooding. Watertight doors were sealed, trapping men in some compartments while saving others. Pumps worked at maximum capacity but could not keep pace with the inrushing ocean. Power failed in damaged sections. Communications broke down. In the engine rooms, men felt the deck tilting beneath their feet, heard the groaning of stressed metal, knew instinctively that the ship was dying. Incredibly, Rear Admiral Masami Ban, Fusō's captain, failed to report the damage to Nishimura. Whether from shock, from communications failure when the radio equipment was damaged, or from the sheer overwhelming chaos of managing flooding compartments while under fire, no message went out. Nishimura steamed onward, unaware that he had just lost half his battleship strength. Behind him, Fusō fell out of formation, burning, listing, her crew abandoning stations as flooding spread beyond control. She would remain afloat for another half hour, slowly capsizing, before finally rolling over and sinking. Over 1,200 men went down with her. Behind Fusō, the Japanese destroyer screen suffered catastrophic losses. Yamagumo took a direct torpedo hit, amidships. Her magazines detonated in a towering explosion that lit the entire strait for seconds, a pillar of flame and debris that climbed hundreds of feet into the night sky. The destroyer simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the detonation of her own ammunition. Wreckage rained down across the water. There were no survivors. Michishio absorbed a torpedo that detonated beneath her keel, breaking her spine. The destroyer stopped dead, power gone, steering gone, wallowing in the current. She would drift for hours before finally sinking, her crew helpless to save her. Asagumo lost her entire bow to another torpedo hit. The explosion severed everything forward of the bridge. The destroyer transformed from a fighting ship into a cripple in seconds, capable only of limping away at reduced speed. She would sink later, finished off by cruiser gunfire and aircraft. Within 5 minutes of coordinated attack, Nishimura had lost 1 battleship and 3 of his 4 destroyers. His formation, tight and professional minutes earlier, had dissolved into chaos. Ships burned, men screamed, radio discipline collapsed as damage reports and cries for help flooded the frequencies. And still Nishimura did not know the full extent of the disaster. Communications had broken down so completely that he had no clear picture of what remained under his command. Captain Coward's destroyers barely escaped unscathed. Japanese gunfire pursued them through their own smoke screens. Shells splashed close, but the torpedo attack had succeeded beyond expectation. Now came the left flank destroyers under Captain Roland Smoot. Monson, Hutchins, and Bush raced in from the west, mirroring Coward's attack. They launched 15 torpedoes collectively. Several hit Yamashiro. The flagship shuddered under the impacts but remained combat-capable, her armoured belt absorbing punishment that would have gutted lighter vessels. Still, flooding spread. Damage control teams struggled to contain seawater pouring through ripped plating. At 0330, Nishimura finally grasped the disaster unfolding around him. He transmitted a terse message. Enemy torpedo boats and destroyers on both sides of northern entrance to Surigao Strait. 2 of our destroyers torpedoed and drifting. Yamashiro hit by 1 torpedo but fit for battle. The message reached Tokyo. It reached Vice Admiral Shima, still steaming north behind Nishimura. It reached American radio operators, who read the intercept and understood that Japanese resolve remained unbroken, despite crippling losses. Nishimura did not turn back. To retreat meant abandoning Shogo, abandoning Kurita's central force, abandoning any hope of disrupting the Leyte landings. So he steamed forward with what remained. 1 battleship, 1 heavy cruiser, Mogami, 1 destroyer, Shigure, 3 ships against an entire fleet. It was madness. It was duty. It was the mathematics of desperation transformed into forward motion through black water. Aboard West Virginia, radar operators tracked the approaching contacts with growing precision. At 0316, the scope painted clear images at 42,000 yards. Lieutenant Commander McComb called out ranges and bearings in steady professional tones. The battleships adjusted course slightly, aligning their broadsides. Turret crews stood ready. Powder bags sat loaded in hoists. Shells rested in breeches. Firing keys waited for the order. Oldendorf watched the developing picture with cold satisfaction. The T was crossed. The Japanese had walked into the killing zone. But he held fire, conserving precious armor-piercing ammunition. The cruisers would strike first, adding to the chaos, forcing Japanese gunners to split their attention. At 0351, the left flank cruisers opened up. Louisville, Portland, Minneapolis, Denver, Columbia. 8-inch guns and 6-inch guns erupted nearly simultaneously. Shells arced through darkness, guided by radar solutions. The Japanese had no effective answer. Their older fire control systems could not track targets at these ranges in pitch blackness. Yamashiro's main battery fired back, 12 14-inch guns belching flame. Mogami added her 10 8-inch guns, but they shot at muzzle flashes and guesswork, their shells falling uselessly into empty ocean. The American cruisers walked their salvos closer with each adjustment, radar feedback refining aim. Hits began landing. Yamashiro's superstructure took damage. Fires started. Still, she steamed forward, her propellers churning, her forward momentum carrying her deeper into the trap. At 0352, Oldendorf cleared the battleships to fire. The range had closed to 22,000 yards, 12 miles, excessive for older gunnery systems that relied on optical rangefinders and human calculations. Comfortable, almost leisurely, for Mark 8 radar direction that painted targets with electronic precision. West Virginia's fire control officer, Lieutenant Commander McComb, achieved a firing solution at 0353. Target, Yamashiro. Range, 26,000 yards. Bearing, steady. Course, predictable. Speed, slowing under damage. The solution locked. The order crackled through the ship's communications network. Commence firing. West Virginia's #1 turret elevated slightly, hydraulics humming as the massive guns rose to the calculated angle. The breech locks closed with authoritative clanks. Inside the turret, the gun captain's hand hovered over the firing key. Outside, on deck, every loose object had been secured. Every hatch had been dogged tight. The concussion from 16-inch guns could shatter glass, pop rivets, throw unsecured equipment across compartments. Men braced themselves, those near the guns stuffing cotton in their ears, knowing it would barely help. The firing key turned. 2 16-inch guns roared as one, their barrels recoiling violently inward, the entire ship shuddering from the force. Flame erupted from the muzzles, brilliant orange-white flashes that illuminated the entire forward section in stark detail for an instant. The report was beyond loud. It was a physical blow, a pressure wave that slammed into every exposed surface, squeezed lungs, rattled teeth. The smell of propellant, acrid and chemical, rolled across the deck. The shells themselves, each weighing 2,250 pounds, over a ton of steel and explosive, raced through darkness at over 2,500 feet per second. They flew for more than 30 seconds, arcing high through the black sky. Invisible, their trajectory calculated by radar and fire control computers to intersect with a target 12 miles distant. For those 30 seconds, nothing could be done. No correction was possible. The shells were committed, and all that remained was to wait and see where they fell. On Yamashiro's bridge, lookouts saw flashes on the horizon, multiple ships firing simultaneously. The initial salvos fell short, raising towering waterspouts that collapsed into white foam. But the Americans were walking their fire closer with each adjustment, radar feedback refining aim with mechanical precision. Within minutes, shells began landing on target. The impacts were devastating. 14-inch and 16-inch armor-piercing shells struck Yamashiro's superstructure, penetrating thin plating and detonating inside. Fires erupted, steel fragmented. Men died instantly, shredded by shell splinters or incinerated by explosions. West Virginia fired 16 complete salvos over the next 19 minutes, 93 rounds of 16-inch armor-piercing ammunition. Every 6 shells, the turret crews paused briefly to clear the breaches, reload the massive shells and powder bags, and resume firing. The rate of fire was deliberate, measured, professional. 3 salvos every 2 minutes. This was not panic fire, wildly shooting in hope of hitting something. This was execution, methodical, calculated. Each salvo refined based on the previous impact, radar tracking the shell splashes, fire control computers adjusting angles and charges. Tennessee and California joined the bombardment within 2 minutes of West Virginia's opening salvo. Their 14-inch guns added to the weight of metal falling on the Japanese formation. Tennessee fired 69 shells. California fired 63. Each shell carried enough explosive to obliterate a building. Concentrated on a single battleship already damaged by torpedo hits and burning from earlier cruiser fire, the effect was overwhelming. Yamashiro's superstructure became an inferno. The pagoda tower, that distinctive Japanese design of stacked bridges, took multiple hits that shredded the upper levels. Maryland, using older Mark IV fire control radar, aimed at waterspouts kicked up by other ships' shells, firing when she could identify targets through the forest of splashes. Pennsylvania and Mississippi held fire, or fired. Conservatively, their ammunition stocks critically low, and their radar inadequate for the range. The combined firepower was staggering. Hundreds of heavy shells converged on a formation that now consisted of essentially 1 battleship and 1 cruiser. Yamashiro absorbed hit after hit, her armor belt held against some. Others penetrated, detonating inside compartments, starting fires, killing crew members. The superstructure became an inferno. Radar antennas were sheared away. The bridge took damage. Still, the flagship ploughed forward. Her engineering spaces remained functional. Her forward turrets still fired. The will to fight persisted even as the ship died around her crew. At 0402, Oldendorf ordered ceasefire, not from mercy, from practicality. His battleships had nearly exhausted their armor-piercing stocks. West Virginia had only 110 rounds remaining. Continuing the bombardment risked running completely dry. Better to conserve shells in case a second wave appeared. The cruisers and destroyers could finish the cripples. On the radar screens, Yamashiro's pip grew erratic. Her speed dropped. She began turning, attempting to retreat. But it was far too late. At 0409, more torpedoes struck Yamashiro's starboard side. American destroyers had maneuvered for final attacks during the battleship bombardment, positioning themselves for kill shots. Probably Benyon or Newcomb, both having closed to optimal range while the bigger ships fired. The torpedoes hit were catastrophic. Multiple detonations within seconds, each tearing massive holes in the battleship's already damaged hull. Yamashiro's keel cracked audibly, a grinding metallic shriek that carried across the water. Her spine broken, flooding overwhelmed every damage control effort. Pumps failed. Electrical systems went dark. The battleship began listing to port, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as thousands of tons of seawater poured into compromised compartments. Fires illuminated her silhouette against the black water, painting the death of a warship in orange and red. The entire midships section blazed. Secondary explosions cooked off stored ammunition, adding to the pyrotechnic display. Smoke poured from every rupture in her hull, mixing with steam from ruptured boilers. Men emerged from below decks, staggering, burned, choking on smoke and fumes. Some jumped immediately into the oil-slicked water. Others hesitated, looking back at the ship, unable to believe she was truly sinking. Captain Rear Admiral Katsukiyo Shinoda, Yamashiro's commanding officer, stood on the bridge amid the chaos and calmly issued his final order. Abandon ship. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as though giving routine instructions rather than condemning himself to death. Around him, staff officers moved to comply, but Shinoda himself made no move to leave. He would go down with his command, as tradition and honor required. Vice Admiral Nishimura stood beside him, silent, his face impassive. He had led his men into this maelstrom, led them knowing the odds, led them because duty demanded sacrifice, and Shogo allowed no alternative. He would not abandon them now, would not swim while they drowned, would not survive while they died. At 0419, Yamashiro capsized. The list accelerated past the point of no return. Men still on deck scrambled for handholds as the world tilted 90 degrees. The pagoda superstructure, that towering multi-deck bridge distinctive to Japanese battleships, collapsed inward like a toppling building. Steel screamed. Rivets popped. The entire structure came apart as the battleship rolled completely over, her hull momentarily visible, rust-streaked and barnacled, before sliding beneath the surface. Debris exploded outward, furniture and equipment and human bodies flung into the water by the suction of sinking. Nearly 1,600 officers and men went down with her. Nishimura, Shinoda, the entire command staff. Engineering crews trapped below when hatches were sealed. Gun crews still at their stations. Men who hesitated too long, or who chose to stay rather than abandon their ship. In seconds, the radar pip that had represented Yamashiro disappeared from American screens. One moment, a clear, bright return. The next, nothing. Empty water. The Southern Forces flagship was gone, erased as completely as if she had never existed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Mogami and Shigure turned desperately, racing south, fleeing the slaughter. Mogami had taken brutal damage during the battleship barrage. Her superstructure burned. Steering was compromised. She could barely maintain speed. Shigure, less damaged by sheer luck, zigzagged through the smoke and debris, her commander knowing that survival depended on speed and darkness. Behind them, Fusō's hulk still, floated in two sections, both burning, both sinking slowly. The wreckage littered the strait like tombstones. Oldendorf did not pursue with his battleships. Their mission was to guard the northern exit, not chase cripples through narrow waters where submarines or air attacks at dawn could prove costly. Instead, he ordered his cruisers and destroyers to finish the job. They raced south, hunting the survivors. At 0425, Vice Admiral Shima's second striking force finally arrived at the battlefield. His two heavy cruisers, Nachi and Ashigara, and 4 destroyers had been following Nishimura throughout the night. Poor radio coordination meant Shima barely understood what had happened ahead. As his formation approached, lookouts spotted what they believed were the wrecks of both Japanese battleships. Actually, they saw Fusō's two halves, but the mistake was understandable in darkness and chaos. Burning wreckage, oil slicks, the unmistakable signs of annihilation. Shima made the only rational decision. He ordered a retreat. There was no point sacrificing his ships to achieve nothing. As his force turned south, his flagship Nachi collided with the fleeing Mogami in the confusion. The impact flooded Mogami's steering room, crippling her further. She fell behind during the retreat, limping and burning. American cruisers Louisville, Portland, and Denver closed on Mogami during the morning of October 25th, pounding her with gunfire. She absorbed more punishment, somehow remaining afloat. Finally, at mid-morning, carrier aircraft from escort carriers that had been supporting the Leyte landings found her. Bombers dove, torpedoes dropped, Mogami's luck expired. She sank, her crew scuttled by friendly torpedoes after abandoning ship, ending her service as one of the war's most damaged vessels to survive repeated battles. Fusō's two sections burned for hours before finally slipping under. American ships approached cautiously, finding wreckage, debris, and bodies. Of Nishimura's original 7-ship force, only the destroyer Shigure escaped southward through the strait. She would survive until January 1945, when the American submarine Blackfin torpedoed and sank her off Malaya. Dawn broke across Surigao Strait on October 25th, revealing a scene of total devastation. The water was slicked with thick layers of fuel oil, black and viscous, spreading for miles in iridescent patches that shimmered in the early light. Wreckage floated everywhere, pieces of ships, wooden planking, steel plates torn and twisted, life jackets empty and stained. Debris fields stretched as far as the eye could see, marking the graves of ships and men. American ships patrolled slowly through the aftermath, picking up survivors where they could be found. But there were few. Most Japanese sailors who survived the sinkings refused rescue. They swam away from rescue lines thrown to them. They pushed away life rings. They turned their backs on, extended hands and paddled desperately toward distant islands, choosing a 4-mile swim through oil and current over captivity. Some simply stopped swimming and slipped beneath the surface, drowning by choice rather than accepting help from the enemy. Cultural conditioning explained some of it. Japanese military training emphasized that capture meant dishonor worse than death. Propaganda warned that Americans tortured prisoners. The concept of Bushido, twisted from its philosophical roots into military policy, taught that surrender stained not just the individual, but his entire family. Better to die than bring shame to one's ancestors. For men who had grown up in this system, who had internalized these values through years of indoctrination, rescue seemed worse than drowning. American sailors watched in horror and confusion. Men trained to save lives, to throw lines to anyone in distress, found their efforts rejected. Destroyers would slow alongside floating Japanese sailors, only to see them swim away. Some shouted defiance. Others simply turned silent backs and swam until exhaustion took them. One American officer described it as watching suicide in slow motion, dozens of men choosing death over the extended hand of compassion. Only those too badly wounded to resist were brought aboard. Some collapsed on deck, whispering apologies in Japanese to unseen spirits. Others stared upward with expressions mixing anger and shame. American medics treated them regardless, applying bandages, administering morphine, fighting to save lives whether the wounded wanted saving or not. For the US Navy, compassion was not conditional. Enemies in battle became patients once the shooting stopped. The scene revealed the vast cultural gulf between the combatants. To the Americans, rescue was duty, an obligation that transcended nationality or ideology. You saved men in the water because they were human beings in distress. To many Japanese, rescue was humiliation, a fate literally worse than death. The difference was not about courage. Both sides had demonstrated extraordinary bravery. It was about fundamental assumptions regarding honor, duty, and the value placed on survival versus abstract concepts of reputation. The tactical statistics told a brutal story. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 2 battleships, 3 destroyers, and suffered severe damage to 1 heavy cruiser. Casualty figures approached 3,000 men. Shima's force escaped largely intact but accomplished nothing. The Southern force had been annihilated in less than 90 minutes of actual combat. American losses were minimal: 39 men killed, 114 wounded. Most casualties occurred aboard the destroyer Albert W. Grant, which had pressed her attack so aggressively that she came under both Japanese fire and friendly fire from American cruisers unable to identify her in the chaos. Grant took multiple hits, suffered severe damage, but survived. Her crew's courage exemplified the aggression that characterized the entire engagement. For the battleship crews, particularly those aboard the Pearl Harbor survivors, the victory carried profound symbolic weight. These were the same ships that had burned and sank in December 1941, ships declared obsolete by aviation advocates, ships written off as too slow, too vulnerable, too outdated for modern war. Yet when circumstances aligned geography, tactics, technology, and training, they had executed the most one-sided naval victory of the Pacific War. West Virginia had fired first among the battleships. The same ship that took 7 torpedoes at Pearl Harbor. The same ship that spent 30 months under reconstruction. The same ship whose crew pulled 70 bodies from flooded compartments during salvage, including one compartment where a calendar had been scratched off until December 23rd, showing men had survived for 16 days before succumbing to asphyxiation. Those ghosts had been avenged. Not through emotion or rage. Through cold, professional, radar-directed firepower. The Battle of Surigao Strait marked the last time in history that battleships would engage each other with main battery guns. The age of the dreadnought, which began with HMS Dreadnought's launch in 1906, ended in these dark waters. After this night, aircraft carriers and submarines would dominate naval warfare. The battle line, that formation drilled into generations of officers, would fade into obsolescence, but for one final night, it had proven its lethal elegance. The tactical doctrine of crossing the T, studied in every naval academy, executed perfectly only twice in the age of modern battleships, Tsushima in 1905 and Surigao Strait in 1944, demonstrated what happened when geography, preparation, and technology converged. Oldendorf had positioned his forces with textbook precision. The narrow strait compressed the Japanese into a single, vulnerable column. Radar eliminated the traditional advantage of darkness. Destroyer torpedo attacks crippled the enemy formation before the big guns even spoke, and when the battleships finally opened fire, they did so with overwhelming superiority in numbers, technology, and tactical positioning. Admiral Nishimura's decision to press forward despite catastrophic losses has been debated by historians. Some view it as suicidal devotion to duty. Others see it as rational within the context of Shogo's desperate logic. If the central force under Kurita was to have any chance of breaking through to Leyte Gulf, the southern approach had to draw American forces, pin them, force them to commit resources. Nishimura accomplished that mission even as his ships burned around him. He tied down Oldendorf's entire battle line, ensuring those battleships could not reposition to threaten Kurita. But Kurita's force, after breaking through San Bernardino Strait and engaging escort carriers off Samar, ultimately turned back without reaching the invasion beaches. The sacrifice bought nothing. The Japanese plan collapsed not from lack of courage, but from failures in coordination, timing, and the overwhelming material superiority the United States brought to bear. By late 1944, American shipyards launched carriers faster than Japan could train pilots. American logistics kept fleets supplied across vast ocean distances. American technology, from radar to damage control systems, had surpassed anything Japan fielded. The Battle of Surigao Strait crystallized this imbalance. 5 American battleships raised from Pearl Harbor's mud confronted 2 Japanese battleships that had spent the war in training backwaters. The result was predetermined not by tactics alone, but by the vast industrial and technological chasm that had opened between the belligerents. In that sense, the battle was less a contest than an execution. Not of men, though thousands died, of an illusion. An illusion that courage and traditional tactics could overcome material disadvantage. Japan's admirals understood this. After Surigao Strait and the broader defeat at Leyte Gulf, the combined fleet ceased to exist as a coherent offensive force. Remaining ships huddled in ports, fuel-starved, unable to train, waiting for the inevitable. The kamikaze, desperation weaponized, became Japan's primary naval strategy. Ships were relegated to kamikaze escorts or stripped for scrap. The age of surface combat had passed. For the United States Navy, Surigao Strait validated decisions made years earlier, the choice to salvage the Pearl Harbor battleships rather than scrap them. The investment in radar fire control systems. The emphasis on destroyer tactics and torpedo reliability. The creation of integrated task forces where different ship types coordinated seamlessly. All these elements, forged through painful early defeats in the Solomons and refined through constant adaptation, culminated in this single overwhelming victory. It also validated something more fundamental. The old rules still applied. Crossing the T worked, ambush positioning worked, concentrated firepower worked. Technology enhanced these principles but did not replace them. The tactics that Admiral Nelson would have recognized, translated into 20th century systems, proved as lethal as ever when properly executed. Modern warfare had not erased the fundamentals, it had merely accelerated and amplified them. In the years after the war, naval officers studied Surigao Strait exhaustively. The Naval War College dissected every decision, every maneuver, every technological advantage. It became the textbook example of how to fight a surface engagement. Students learned about proper fleet positioning, about the integration of scouts, destroyers, cruisers, and battleships into a layered defense, about ammunition management and radar exploitation. But they also learned that circumstances had been perfect. Narrow waters. Advance intelligence. Technological superiority. Numerical advantage. How often would all those factors align again? Never, as it turned out. Surigao Strait was both culmination and ending. The battleships that fought there would serve out the war, providing fire support for amphibious landings. West Virginia, Tennessee, and California bombarded beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, their big guns pounding Japanese fortifications. Pennsylvania took a torpedo from an aerial attack at Okinawa, suffering casualties but surviving. Mississippi served until the war's end. Maryland provided fire support throughout the Philippines campaign, but none would again fire at an enemy battleship. That role had vanished into history on October 25, 1944. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, West Virginia was in Tokyo Bay, the only Pearl Harbor survivor present at the ceremony. She sat at anchor, while General MacArthur and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz received Japanese envoys aboard USS Missouri. Her presence was symbolic. The battleship that had sunk on December 7, 1941, had sailed to Japan's capital to witness the ending. It was poetic closure. Revenge was an inadequate word. This was completion. In the decades following the war, the battleships of Surigao Strait were gradually decommissioned and scrapped. West Virginia was retired in 1947, sold for scrap in 1959. Tennessee met the same fate. California, Maryland, Pennsylvania, all reduced to steel ingots. Mississippi served longest, finally decommissioned in 1956. Their passing marked the end of an era that had already ended that night in Surigao Strait. Naval doctrine moved on. The aircraft carrier became the capital ship. Submarines armed with nuclear missiles became the ultimate deterrent. Surface combatants shrank in size, grew in speed, and bristled with guided missiles that rendered gun duels obsolete. The battle line, that majestic formation of dreadnoughts steaming in column, vanished from naval planning. But for those who studied history, who understood that warfare is not linear progress but cycles of adaptation, Surigao Strait remained instructive. It showed that old lessons never fully die, that geography still matters, that technological advantage compounds tactical skill, that preparation, training, and doctrine can transform numerical superiority into devastating victory, and perhaps most importantly, that sometimes the supposedly outdated can prove lethally effective when deployed correctly. Admiral Oldendorf did not rely on innovation. He relied on execution. He took the tools available to him, the Pearl Harbor survivors, and the doctrine written decades before, and applied them with textbook precision. The human cost of that precision was staggering for those on the receiving end. 3,000 Japanese sailors died that night. Young men conscripted into service, trained to believe their emperor and nation required their sacrifice, sent into a battle their commanders knew was likely suicide. They steamed northward through darkness toward overwhelming force because orders demanded it. Duty demanded it. The mathematics of desperation offered no alternative. Their courage deserves recognition separate from the tactical analysis. To sail into gunfire, to maintain formation while ships explode around you, to keep firing even as your vessel burns and lists, requires a form of resolve that transcends rational calculation. Nishimura's crew knew the odds. They pressed on anyway. That is not stupidity. It is the terrible logic of total war, where individual survival becomes secondary to strategic objectives, however hopeless. The Americans, for their part, fought with professional efficiency rather than hatred. Radar operators called bearings, gun crews loaded shells, officers gave orders. The killing was systematic, almost clinical. This was not Pearl Harbor's chaos and shock. This was controlled violence, executed according to plan. When the battleships ceased fire, it was not from compassion but ammunition conservation. The distinction matters. War had become industrialized, its conduct determined by logistics and doctrine rather than individual rage. And yet, the Pearl Harbor survivors carried personal stakes. Men who had fought fires on sinking ships, who had pulled bodies from wreckage, who had spent years repairing and rebuilding, found themselves in position to settle accounts. That motivation, channeled through discipline and training, added an edge to the professional conduct. The victory was institutional, but for the survivors, it was also deeply personal. Surigao Strait represented what happened when preparation met opportunity. The American Navy had learned from early defeats, fixed torpedo problems, developed radar, trained destroyer squadrons in coordinated attacks, rebuilt damaged ships with modern equipment, created integrated command structures. All these improvements, accumulated through 3 years of war, converged in one perfect ambush that rewrote the tactical calculus of surface combat. For Japan, the battle exposed the fatal weakness of trying to fight an industrial power without industry. By 1944, American shipyards outproduced Japan by margins that made strategic victory impossible. Every lost cruiser, every sunken destroyer, represented irreplaceable losses. Training new crews took months Japan did not have. Fuel shortages grounded ships that remained afloat. The material imbalance had become so pronounced that even flawless execution could not overcome it. Shogo was not flawed tactics. It was desperate strategy applied to an unwinnable situation. Send everything, sacrifice everything, hope for a miracle. The miracle did not come. Kurita turned back. Nishimura died. The carriers decoyed north were destroyed. The invasion of Leyte proceeded unhindered. Within weeks, American forces had secured the island. Within months, they moved on to Luzon. The Philippines, cornerstone of Japan's southern defences, fell. The home islands became the next target. Historians marking turning points often cite Midway as the Pacific War's decisive battle. Midway halted Japanese expansion, but Leyte Gulf, of which Surigao Strait was one component, shattered the combined fleet's ability to contest American operations. After October 1944, Japan could no longer mount coherent naval resistance. The outcome became a question of when, not if. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.